Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the IBTM hosting of the Business Events Manifesto webinar in partnership with JMIC and the Iceberg. My name is Shane Hannam, the IBTM Events Portfolio Director, and of course this is the third webinar today after our colleagues in AIME hosted the APAC region this morning, and Meetings Africa took the baton to host the second session later on this morning for the Middle East and Africa region. We now are delighted as IBTM to be able to bring you this live for the European region, and in turn we'll pass that baton on to Karina and the IMEX team to cover the Americas later. So as you know, a very joined up, probably the first joined up collaboration in our industry. We're delighted to be a part of it, but I think it highlights the importance of what we are trying to achieve today. And just to further that, I am delighted to be here with a very high profile panel as well. I'm pleased to offer a very warm welcome to Kai Hattendorf, the CEO of our Exhibitions Association, UFI, and also, as we all know, the president of JMIC. We're also joined today by Chloe Meninick, who wears the hat of a board director of ESAE, the European Society of Association Executives. And last but not least, we have Mr. Simon Hughes, the chair of BVEP, which is the British Visits and Events Partnerships. Thank you all very much for being here today. It's great to get you all together, and of course we'll have hopefully some really good question and answers for you towards the end of the webinar. So our webinar today combines more than 25 industry perspectives from all around the globe, as well as interactive conversation with renowned Global Cities Authority, Professor Greg Clark. It's aimed at delivering insights into what factors are most likely to emerge as our industry drivers and competitive issues in a post-COVID-19 world. And really the format for today is a two-part webinar. There will be a video that we'll turn over to in a moment for part one. We will then pause for a coffee break, and then we will roll into the second part of the video. And from there, we will then have a question and answer session with our wonderful panel. So please feel free to ask all of your questions as we go along. There is a question box and we can all see those, so we will actually address them at the end of the session, but please feel free to ask them as we go along. Right, okay, so that's all for me to say now really is please sit back and enjoy the amazing collaboration and the thought leadership from the business events industry. I will now begin the first video. Just before I do that, again, a very warm welcome to our panel. Thank you all of you guys for joining today. And secondly, welcome to everyone else who's joined us from all across Europe and beyond. It's great to see that we're all connected in one voice. So without further ado, I will now begin with the webinar.
Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you may be watching this. And on behalf of the whole global JMIC community, welcome to this webinar. Now, what we're trying to do here today is to bring together a best of when it comes to our industry's approaches to COVID-19. Now, we've all heard it, we've all said it. This is an unprecedented situation. It's certainly the biggest threat to our industry I've experienced in my professional career, and I think the same goes for many of you. So it is really, really important that as an industry we find ways to align the way we argue. We find ways to speak with one voice. We find ways to be, as diverse as we are as an industry, a united industry when we talk to decision makers, when we talk to lawmakers, when we talk to those who we rely on to get back our license to operate, and also to have the right words and messages in place to convince our customers, the communities we work for, that it is safe to return to events of all kinds around the world. Just as we have changed and adapted to needs before, our industry will change and adapt to the needs and rise to the challenge that COVID-19 gives us. How fast we succeed and how our industry looks on the other side, how many jobs we can save, how many new business we can generate. This is up to us and the support we can give our respective members and communities right now when we are probably as associations, more needed than we've been in a long time. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching this, and I hope you have an insightful session.
Hello, and a very warm welcome from London to the Iceberg. If you've not come across us before, we're an online platform dedicated to celebrating the legacies of business events, not the smaller visible tip of hotel and travel spending that pokes up above the surface, but the much greater and weightier longer-term benefits to society that lie hidden beneath the water, harder to see and also difficult to measure, the true impact of holding meetings. The Iceberg is presented by the Joint Meetings Industry Council, and JMIC is in the process of creating a manifesto for economic recovery using business events, a template or toolkit for industry advocacy to help the sector around the world position the safe reopening of meetings as a solution to the economic rebuilding necessary in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was decided to hold this webinar to support discussion around the manifesto, and 4 iconic industry events have joined forces to sponsor our content today. AIME, the Asia Pacific Incentives and Meetings event, IMEX and its new Planet IMEX platform, IBTM and its new IBTM Connect platform, and Meetings Africa. Huge thanks to all of those 4. Collaboration in crisis indeed. We have an extraordinary cast of contributors coming up, not to mention the remarkable mind of Professor Greg Clark, Global Advisor on Cities. But our first stop is Canada and JMIC's own Rod Cameron. Rod.
Well, thanks, Robert. I just want to say a very few words about the manifesto itself, which is what this process all today has been revolving around. I think we all appreciate that as an industry, we are a global industry. But in terms of the decisions that are being made around the future of our industry, particularly today, most of these are being made locally. And they fall really into 2 categories because it's all about reopening. Within the reopening envelope, we've got the question of how, and we've got the question of why. The how is really around the question of how it is we can reactivate events and welcome delegates while still respecting the kinds of health and safety protocols that have been put in place in those communities and the decisions that have to be made by local authorities to let us actually do that. The why is a little more complicated. It revolves around the question of why it is we should be receiving a priority in a situation where there are so many looking for government attention and government priority. And our answer there has been consistently because we are uniquely positioned to be able to drive not only economic recovery, but also economic transition, economic renewal of a sort that's going to be desperately important to governments around the world coming out of the recessions that are deriving from the pandemic all over the world right now. Now, to pull this kind of a document together and address those issues, we need 2 things. The first is good input from the industry itself, from industry leaders that can capture the breadth and the implications and the examples that we need to tell our story effectively. And secondly, we need good advice from experts on the outside with experience in dealing with local government, local decision making, and advise us as to how we can best deliver those messages in this kind of a time. And of course, in that regard, we could not possibly have had a better resource than Greg Clark, and we thank him for his generosity in sharing that knowledge with us. With those 2 components in place, I think we could say confidently that within a very few days, we'll have a final version of the manifesto that does reflect that input. At the same time, we will have a package, an aggregation of all of the input we received in the process of developing it, and which can be used to come up with specific examples and variations on the themes that people can adapt and use in their own situation. Thank all of you for participating in that process and making this manifesto possible. We hope it will be a useful tool to you and your members going forward, and that you will continue to contribute your thoughts around this process as it evolves, because it is an evolving process and we'll need to keep updating on a regular basis. With that, back to you, Robert.
Rod, thank you. As Rod was hinting there, a large amount of discussion has already been contributed in the creation of the JMIC Manifesto for Economic Recovery using Business Events, much of it in video form. More than 24 of the sector's established and emerging leading lights have either submitted their own video recordings to us for this programme or Zoomed with my colleague James Latham, the founder of the ICEBERG. It does keep James out of mischief. So before I introduce Greg Clark, let's go to this panel first to remind ourselves of what meetings and the meetings industry actually are and what the world is now without face-to-face business events.
What's the purpose of business events? Conventions, congresses and events are platforms for exchanging experiences and ideas.
We not only create communities, we grow communities, we engage communities, we activate communities via events, and actually we even monetize communities.
The impact of a congress isn't only economic, but is so much bigger for the individual who participates in a congress and gets inspired, or inspire his or her peers from all over the world, but also the legacy of the event on the city, the local community, the region, and the world.
They contribute towards a body of knowledge about a specific area or topic. They contribute towards the evolution of that particular space. When great minds get together, they tend to come up with solutions.
Businesses and governments everywhere over the past 10-15 years have recognised that the most efficient and effective way to communicate is through live events. So that's why we were on a high in January 2020. You know, we must remember that and must convey that in our messaging.
You know, the world has changed. It's absolutely turned upside down and stopped in its tracks in terms of us procuring or acquiring international events.
We've fought tirelessly for our industry to be recognised by national governments, by local governments, by city fathers. And it's tragic that our industry has practically had to crumble before governments realise just how valuable the meetings industry is.
The $35 billion that the industry creates in Australia, of course, is no longer happening. Therefore, that money is not flowing through to the hotels, the restaurants, the taxis, the entertainment, but also not to the small farmers and producers and the wine growers that we buy our produce on.
And everybody sees there's a lot of money missing. And there's a lot of people who don't have work, and there's a lot of companies going bankrupt. So
we see the influence of an absence of the meetings industry at the moment, with less interaction going on at scientific level within groups, research groups all over the world, and less transfers between the business world and the research and science development worlds.
And your elected officials go, okay, it's not just that I miss the events business right now because I'm not seeing those heads and beds and it's creating some budgetary problems on me. It's like, well, all of a sudden, all these other challenges in my community aren't being met as well. The universities are missing the collaborations. Local governments who are getting boosts from experts, providing their expertise free of charge or being able to leverage knowledge that was created in these events, all of a sudden those went away too.
Governments that are serious about their economic and social recovery should be looking for drivers to facilitate this. I believe that the business and professional events industry is such a driver and will do just that.
Exhibitions and business events are the meeting places and the marketplaces that everyone needs, that societies need, that communities need, that industries need to recover after COVID-19.
We are a real driver in that, and that's, I think, the main point, that the one clear message we need to get across with one clear voice.
A driver for transformation and the perfect platform for introducing a destination to these knowledge-rich communities, which then in turn can help to secure the talent, the investment and the knowledge transfer that they require.
We know what we've lost by live events not taking place, and it's important that as soon as it's safe to do so, we can reinvigorate those live events and come together to communicate in the most effective way that we know, which is face-to-face.
In part one of this webinar, we're looking at meetings and the role they rightly play in developing city destinations of all sizes. We'll also be talking about associations, their events, and the amazing legacies they can leave in partnership with cities. In part two, we'll look at meeting in the age of the pandemic, and we'll get to discussing advocacy and the manifesto in more detail. Taking us through this journey is one of the greatest contemporary thinkers on urban development consulting today. Professor Greg Clark is a global advisor on cities to many and varied institutions, working with businesses, governments and over 100 cities on strategies for development and investment. His unique take on the role meetings play in urban development has made him a star keynote in recent years at a number of major industry events. Greg Clark, a very warm welcome to the Iceberg.
Robert, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. And looking at the opening video, of course, we're reminded that so many of the important business meetings that happen in the world happen in cities. And I've previously said at various events convened by the industry that this is a very important sector for cities. This provides to cities strategic connections, assets, amenities, and infrastructures they wouldn't otherwise have. The meetings industry produces a long-term legacy for the city, not just in terms of how its economy emerges, but also in terms of the breadth of its supply chains and its participation. I've said various times that all cities are in different stages of their own economic development and diversification, and business events contribute towards that. And much more importantly, I would say business events have the ability to project the soft power of a city. Business events are kind of a metaphor for the convening capabilities that cities have, and they're also a way of delivering precise messages, stories about that city to a globally mobile and high-value audience. So what's not to like about business events and the role they play in cities? But COVID-19 has come along, and you've just heard from industry leaders that it's already had this significant effect of cancelling many events, and the cost of not being able to meet has become very clear. Now, I've been doing quite a lot of work looking forward to how the new normal may be different to the old normal that we had before COVID-19. And there are 7 quick themes I want to rehearse for you now, because I want to talk about how they're going to affect the meetings industry moving forward. The first of these is what's sometimes called the sovereign capability agenda. This is about supply chains, it's about trade routes, it's about the fact that COVID-19 has revealed that the push for efficiency in the way supply chains have worked has reduced the resilience of those supply chains simultaneously but unintentionally. So whether the concern is for medical supplies, whether it's for pharmaceuticals, food, drinking water, energy, oil, gas, or whether it's to do with critical components for national industries, both national governments and major corporates have become concerned that the form of globalization we were pursuing before COVID-19 was not resilient and therefore not fit for purpose when a crisis like that came. Therefore, we're seeing a new agenda emerge about nations trying to be more self-sufficient, at least in goods that are critical for national security. And we're seeing companies trying to diversify their supply chains and their inputs. This creates, of course, major challenges in some locations that have been at the end of these value chains, but it creates very important opportunities for some cities and regions to diversify their economy and to reshore, onshore or nearshore. Some of us call this the just-in-case agenda as opposed to the just-in-time agenda. The second big theme that's emerged has obviously been the massive uptick in digitization that's happened during the lockdown process. Whether we're talking about video conferencing and flexible working, or whether the focus is on telemedicine and distance learning, or whether it's about the online use of entertainment channels and other kinds of platforms, or the pickup, for example, in esports and e-gaming, or whether we're simply focused on online retail and delivery models, this massive uptick in digitization has led to the reform of lots of business models in various sectors, moving towards the as-a-service business model much more quickly. And of course, we've had meetings as a service begin to evolve from this. The third big theme, of course, is about human health. Coronavirus has revealed, as it were, not just inadequacies in certain healthcare services in certain countries, but it's also revealed massive inequalities in the way that people entered the pandemic in terms of their health status and conditions, elderly people, people with respiratory diseases, people from minority ethnic groups, all of whom being much more severely attacked than others. And inequalities, of course, in the way that healthcare services have been available. This has been revealed in a stark way that has led to a big shift in public opinion about how healthcare services might need to be resourced in the future and what will be considered a fair healthcare system. Now, respiratory health has a close connection with air quality. And this leads on to the fourth point that's emerged from coronavirus, which is that the link between human health and planetary health has become much clearer as a result. Not only do people with respiratory diseases experience worse infections in terms of coronavirus, and that links back to air quality and carbon emissions, but the virus itself originates in our interventions through our food supply systems, in the animal kingdom, in biodiversity, and everything we know about where this virus began tells us that there's something about our food systems that needs correction. At the same time, the lockdown experience during the pandemic has given people the opportunity to live a low touch, low contact, low mobility, low carbon way of living, which has been a kind of a demonstration project, a kind of proof of concept that shows that certain kinds of low carbon living and low carbon working are more feasible than perhaps we thought before. All of this is likely to lead to a greater push towards sustainability and net zero carbon in the way we try to recover from the economic crisis that's about to unfold. And you can see this already with the green recovery programs that are being put in place in Europe and Asia Pacific. The sixth big theme that's emerged from coronavirus is a change of the relationship between citizens and national governments. On the one hand, national governments have had to enact new laws, take more control, be highly prohibitive in terms of what people are allowed to do during the pandemic. And on the other hand, citizens have willingly shared their data, been told where to go and what to do, what not to do in particular. And this has led in some countries to a new bond of trust between citizens and their governments. And in other countries, it's led to a new kind of despair amongst citizens about whether their governments were up for the challenge. So I think this leads to a new set of sorting or sifting occurring between governments that are seen to have done well and governments that are seen to have done less well, a new debate about the role of government in people's lives, as well as, of course, a big impact on our more global geopolitics, where we can see the relationships between China and the world, the US and the world, the US and China, and in general, the climate for multilateralism perhaps being undermined a little bit by this new competitive nationalism orchestrated around this sovereign capability agenda. The sixth big point concerns citizens themselves. Many people during this period of coronavirus have experienced a new kind of social capital, a new neighborliness, mutual help, self-help, more charitable deeds, a growth in philanthropy. And for many people, this has created a kind of a new sense of connection to one another, a new sense of belonging, and a desire to have this increased social capital and increased localism as part of their lives. On the other hand, you can see that coronavirus has led to intolerance of long-lasting inequalities that we can see playing out now in our news media. So on the one hand, we have a citizenry that wants to embrace better connections. On the other hand, we have an intolerance of inequality. And at the same time, we have a massive uptick in digitization. So we think this could lead to the growth of philanthropy, efforts to address inequality in society, and potentially, of course, efforts to tax differently things like digital transactions and to have a lower tolerance threshold, as it were, for tax havens and things like that. Now, these six themes come together with a seventh theme, which is about new spatial patterns. It's rather obvious for anyone who lives or works in a city at the moment that if you have this prolonged period of digital uptake while we're waiting for a vaccine to arrive, then we're going to need increased agility and flexibility in the way our real estate systems work, particularly buildings that serve a single function, an office building, a sports stadium, a university campus, and of course a convention or exhibition centre. And we're also going to need to have new ways of organising our mobility and our transportation systems to render them safe. I think one of the implications of this is that in the long term, we'll see a more distributed kind of urbanisation. I'm not somebody who believes that this is the end of the century of the city, but rather that this provides opportunities for multiple locations to have a more distributed opportunity to engage in hosting key events, hosting certain kinds of jobs and clusters and other kinds of amenities. And it also provides people with more flexibility to either live closer to work by moving into the city centre, or to work closer to where they live by enjoying the opportunities to be in a co-working centre that's in a neighbourhood or a smaller city or town. So these 7 imperatives that arise from the Corona-19 infection seem to me to all have opportunities to influence the new normal, and they all have opportunities to create, as it were, new shaping mechanisms in the way the meetings industry re-emerges after COVID-19.
Greg, you very cleverly closed there with meetings as you opened with meetings. Part of the reason the way you talk about cities has become so interesting to the meetings industry is the prominence you give to business events as a driver for urban development. Let's explore for a moment that intersection that's at the heart of why this sector is always so fascinated to hear what you have to say. Cities and meetings.
Conferences should be seen as the strategic tool that they are to grow cities and to reshape cities. In today's world, a powerful way to rebuild them after the pandemic.
Competition is essentially going to be between cities in terms of attracting startups and attracting young people, of trying to pull money into their R&D and into their university systems.
We've all said it, if you can get the talent, the capital will follow. But the talent's important because it educates your workforce and therefore you get innovation and productivity gains. I do think our universities and our startup and our entrepreneurial community is the backbone of our cities, and we need to nurture that. That's the new coming through. Events are important because when you host an event, you showcase that capital to the world, and then that attracts capital.
Business events should not be sitting alongside tourism and culture. Their rightful place is in the economic engines of cities.
This is not about leisure travel. This is about business travel. This is not about having fun and self-actualization. This is about knowledge exchange and learning and developing industries and developing trade and developing science.
Old school thinking is very difficult to actually shift. Bed tax has distorted the strategic overview. And it's only when the DMO has managed to get a seat at the economic development table and to interface with the inward investment arm and the intellectual capital arm of those cities that things start to change. The pioneers have very much encouraged a new wave of destinations to pick up on that.
We talk about the percentages of conferences that are aligned to the key sectors of Glasgow's economic leadership groups, and we measure the economic benefit from those conferences for the benefit of the city.
It's not just driving the visitor economy, it's driving the knowledge and innovation economy and having a broader set of measures that is far greater than the direct expenditure that you bring in from one particular event. And then you're creating value for your client and for your city.
People see destinations like Sydney and Singapore and they see how successful they are. Many politicians want to emulate that success, but they don't understand that part of the reason for that success was their use of business events as a tool to drive that success. So those kind of case studies are very important and I think will be very powerful.
Greg, let's start with that opening statement from Leslie Williams at Best Cities. Conferences should be seen as strategic tools to grow, shape and rebuild cities. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's very clear, I believe, that business meetings are part of the innovation capacity of a city. And I totally agree with Martin Cirk that locating business meetings in some kind of tourism industry is to get it wrong. You see, urban economies are a combination of consumption activities, production activities, and innovation activities. And increasingly, urban economies are relying on their innovation activities to produce their new job space, to produce the diversification of their sectors, to produce their resilience, and to ensure that their economy moves through the cycles of the global economy in ways that are advantageous. Now, business events, it seems to me, are a strategic tool in those innovation ecosystems. As I said earlier, business events are part of the way the city brands itself to mobile talent, mobile capital, and mobile entrepreneurs. Business events are the convening device that brings together the ecosystems in these innovative sectors. And business events are primarily the mechanism through which cities capture a larger share of those sectors within their territory. You see, in the past, conferences, business meetings were used, as it were, to set standards, to generate exchanges of knowledge, to create the idea of professions emerging together. And much of that activity, it's possible to do now through digital and through online publications. But the area where face-to-face and face-to-place activity is really required is in the emerging sectors where the highest rate of discovery and invention is taking place. So these are the sectors related to medicine, life sciences, pharmaceuticals. They're the sectors related to the digital economy and all of its applications. They're the sectors very much related to creative industries. And they're related very importantly to the circular economy and the many aspects of that are happening, and also to what I would call the advanced urban services, the industries that are building, making, and managing our cities for us. These superclusters are innovation rich, and therefore they are convening heavy. They are clusters that require large numbers of people to get together in order for those ecosystems to be more fertile, to be tighter, and to be deeper. So I expect to see over the next period of time that cities play the critical role in convening these global ecosystems in certain places. And as a consequence of that, those places become leaders in those new, faster growing sectors. Now, I think that Lynn and Martin and colleagues were correct to say that competition underpins this. There's a competition for talent in this. There's a competition for ideas. There's also a competition for mobile capital. And it's the ability of cities to use business events to position themselves with a clear story, identity, and brand, to convene effectively in such a way that they become the place where globally distributed ecosystems need to meet, and then their ability to link that indelibly into their indigenous institutions and economy, that becomes critical. So I agree with what was said. All I want to tell you is that this is not just a niche activity anymore. This is the way that cities are going to diversify their economies and are going to march up the global value chains in the future.
Greg, sometimes when we talk about the roles meetings have in developing cities, it seems we're only referring to the larger star destinations that sit at the top of ICA's annual and hotly contested rankings. But leveraging the power of business and professional events is a game that can be played at all levels.
Many cities are doing that. For example, Buenos Aires, Bogotá, São Paulo. But there are also another emerging cities that are trying to do that. 2 years ago, we gave an award to Punta del Este, for example, that is an emerging city in Uruguay, when they host the famous China LAC event. That was not just economic impact, that was bringing a lot of business creation, innovation for the whole region in Latin America. And that is what we have to show the governments, how this kind of events could help their economies for the recovery in these difficult times.
Our members from second, third tier cities, they are identifying what are their USPs. They're looking at what their focus should be, which are the industries they should be in, rather than you're bidding for all larger events or events which are global nature. Yeah, they are becoming very customized, very focused, and they also want to target associations which are more suitable and qualified for their cities and their countries. So they're looking at very strong intellectual capital. How do we build the knowledge economy? How do we contribute to our local society? More importantly, how do we bring the societal impact into our destination? And then based on that segment, whether it's medical, whether it's telecommunication, whether it's technology, you bid for Congress based on that, where you get more government support and you get the local industry support as well by doing so.
Literally any country can do that. Second, third tier, smaller cities can do that if they've got a university and focus on it. It can happen, and it can make them worldwide capitals in a given industry. That's pretty exciting stuff.
I am very curious about the future of work and what it means for traditionally white-collar jobs needing to be in certain megacities. And if there is a true technology revolution there, and you can begin to say, hey, maybe I don't need to be in Washington, D.C. and paying whatever I pay here. I can go to Columbus, Ohio and pay a third of it. That's a huge opportunity for those second and third tier destinations, combined with the business events, combined with their cluster and their education and healthcare system to, sustainable, generational change.
Well, how interesting. And of course, this agenda about mid-sized cities is a little bit of what I was talking about in relation to this new phenomena of distributed urbanization. So it's very clear to me that in these middle decades of the urban century that we're now in, urbanization is taking on a new form. It's not simply being clustered in the very largest cities in the world, but second, third, and indeed fourth tier cities, as they're sometimes called, although I don't think I really like this idea of tiers. But the smaller cities have a unique strategic opportunity to exploit the uptick in digitization with the drive for high quality of life, with the opportunity that new generation of technologies provide us with to specialize in industries that are rapidly globalizing, but don't necessarily require them to be a very big city. And if the smaller cities put this together with very high quality of life and an appealing story and brand, they can do incredibly well. I'm on the record as saying that I think it's 100 cities that now matter, not 5 to 10. And I think beyond that 100, there are nearly 600 cities in the world that have become important in terms of the production of the new industries agenda that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Now, whether all mid-sized cities are able to become successful destinations, I think, depends upon some other functions. Obviously, there are a very, very large number of mid-sized cities in the world. And it seems to me the ones that are going to succeed are going to have the following characteristics. They're going to have a high quality of life that translates into a great visitor experience. They're going to have some indigenous science, technology, knowledge, or natural asset that they're able to leverage into an innovation proposition. They're going to have, of course, enough physical connectivity to make visiting them for a business meeting work. But they're also at the same time going to have to tell their story about their relevance to the world very well. If we look back at what Kyoto and Medellin and Punta Alegre have done in the last period of time, you see there as an example 3 medium-sized cities that have become distinctively associated with certain kinds of agendas. It's very important for medium-sized cities not to just to try to be the likable option, but to also offer some very distinctive leadership on a very important agenda. Now, having said all of that, I think there's also a natural center of gravity that's going to occur in the larger cities in the world. It is the case that London and New York and Shanghai and Tokyo and Seoul and Hong Kong and Singapore, of course, are very competitive in this space for business events. And as they try to transition their own economies away from a dependence on things like corporate headquarters, banking, other kinds of professional and creative industries, they're moving into the space of competing with cities that used to be specialized in innovation sectors, including high-tech sectors. So I do think that the points made about a high level of competition are there. I think that the large cities are going to be very forceful in the way that they pursue this. I think a drop-off in the travel industry in terms of leisure travel that's been caused by COVID-19 will make it more difficult for destination cities to compete. And therefore, the medium-sized cities that do well will have to have a really effective strategy. I must say I'm also very concerned about the destination cities. These are the locations that combine being a leisure tourism destination with being a meetings host. It's not that I think there will be no more leisure tourism. It's just that I think there will be 2 or 3 years of contraction before they grow again. And I think it's more difficult for leisure tourism destinations to develop the kind of strategic industrial links that are required between indigenous economies, local institutions and others, and the subjects and themes of the business meetings that they host. So it means that for leisure destinations, they're going to have to work very, very hard to be seen to be relevant places to go. And they're also going to have to compensate for a slight drop-off in their own connectivity as the leisure travel industry goes through a reset.
Let's shift our focus away a little from the city and back onto the meetings industry. One particular sector was very well represented in the views we canvassed for this webinar, and that's that of associations. In this field, we not only meet, we also associate.
Associations are non-for-profit and all for purpose. The very nature of an association is to bring added values to its members and thus to the society, and we change the world.
I think associations in this way are actually the veins that are nourishing the societal progress that we need to see, because their member communities represent professionals and industries across the entire spectrum of technological, social, environmental, political, health, or scientific development agendas which any destination has.
Association events bring together communities of practice, helping to facilitate collaborations, cross-sector cooperation, and chance meetings, to create and capitalise on the opportunities that come from meeting face to face.
And it's here that we see the centrality of associations and their events to recovery, whose outcomes in the short term will help drive the economic recovery that we need to see, but whose legacies in the long term will help ensure and sustain thriving destinations.
Association events will play a vital part in the recovery plans from this pandemic.
If you look at the Best Cities portfolio, you'll find many examples of cities who have attracted events that match and support the vision of the destination.
And there's also a real focus on the harmonisation of success criteria, so that both the association and destination can maximise their return on the hosting of each congress or convention.
Estro is a classic example. Estro has chosen Madrid and Copenhagen as partners for future conferences because the association and the city have the same shared vision to improve patient health care.
What we typically do is to use, if I can say so, our Congress, not only as a major tool for scientific dissemination and networking between scientific communities, but also as a catalyzer of opportunities for change.
And an element of that is right at the front end when the RFP comes out and the discussion around event outcomes happens before the destination has even been selected. I think the sensible cities and the wise cities and destinations are having those conversations really early in the lifetime, if you like, of that event. And that's where the greatest successes are happening, I think. A change to that has been really looking at a long-term vision, saying, here's an event we want to attract. We know if they're going to come to our cities, we need to have a research program or a city investment in place. They don't bid for the event and then put it in place. They actually put it in place and then go to the association to say, look, here's our oncology program, here's whatever it may be. you're often able to then fast track the ability for that RFP and that bid to be won, because you've already got the foundations in place of what that association is seeking.
Nobody really cared about sustainability truly until people demanded it in the RFP. We're understanding what your needs are, you're understanding what we can bring to the table, we're able to bring those Venn diagram circles and overlap, and by the time we're here or by the time we leave, we've created something fantastic and sustainable.
So Greg, are cities more deeply understanding the knowledge that associations bring and the needs of those associations?
Well, I think some cities certainly are, and I agree with the comments that have just been made in that video about the importance to cities, to localities, to regions, and indeed to smaller nations of being able to host associations. I agree also with the idea that associations are becoming increasingly choosy, increasingly discerning and demanding, and they're placing upon their hosts the requirement for them to demonstrate their innovation partnership, their commitment to sustainability, their commitment to ESG and all other things. And I agree absolutely that associations are a great accelerator of development for cities, regions, localities, and they provide them with unique, I think, branding and storytelling and convening opportunities. So what's not to like? On the other hand, of course, associations themselves are going to be quite challenged in their own business models over the next few years. On the one hand, a rather deep recession, we know, often leads to reduced budgets for this kind of travel and convening. We know that the uptick in digitization is itself going to change the way they communicate with their members and ask their members to communicate. And we know also that restrictions in terms of travel, which might last for some time, whether or not they're justified, are going to have a dulling effect on this market. So I see very clearly that associations are going to be more careful about how often they do face-to-face meetings and bring large cohorts together, and they're going to have a much more of a blended model, which obviously they've been having for a while, between the digital meetings and the real physical meetings. And so I think that the competition to get association-based meetings is really going to intensify, and that's going to lead to destinations having to work much harder to get them. So I think all of that is going to be true. I think the other great thing that we have to recognize here is that increasingly what I would foresee is not just meetings of associations, but meetings between associations beginning to occur. We're very aware now that the data scientists need to meet with the oncologists and that the software engineers need to meet with the mobility providers, or that the engineering conferences need to have joint conferences now with the real estate conferences. Part of the impact of what we would call sector convergence or clusterization in the economy is that we frequently need to be able to convene more than one association in the same place at the same time. And so the destinations that are able to come forward with the exciting offers in that space and to win, as it were, the support of more than one association to do some kind of combined event, I think will end up being super winners in this process.
Excellent. Well, that concludes part one of our session. And now is that we will go to a coffee break, and we will move on to part two in 2 moments.
The same place at the same time, that are able to come forward with the exciting offers in that space and to win, as it were, the support of more than one association to do some kind of combined event. I think they'll end up being super winners.
What the hell is going on there?
Good afternoon again, everybody. I hope everybody's had the chance to grab a refreshment. Some really insightful stuff in part one there, and I'm very excited in a moment to unveil part two. We did have a slight bit of background noise there. Apologies for that during the coffee break. Hopefully it didn't disturb you too much, but we're all sorted now and ready to continue with part two. And that session, of course, will be concluded by the Q&A, where our panel are standing by to answer the questions that are coming in. So thank you for those that have shared so far. We'll try and get to as many of those as we possibly can. In the meantime, I'll be transferring now to play the second part of the video webinar.
Well, Greg, as we head towards the key content of this webinar, the crowdsourcing of contributions towards the Joint Meetings Industry Council Manifesto for Economic Recovery using business events, let's return to our panel for a moment to understand how the industry is coping with meeting in the age of the pandemic.
Everyone speaks about the new normal, but what is a new normal? Business events are not public or mass gatherings.
Which is a line we've been taking to governments and legislators and authorities around the world, with countries like Germany agreeing exhibitions and events are different from festivals, from concerts, etc.
The trade show industry has been very successful for many years in earning that right to be listened to.
Because we can control the events, we can control the meetings, we know who the people is coming, we know that we have excellent protocols in our venues, in our PCOs, organizers, that we have excellent protocols in the airlines.
We're all looking for a solution to the same problem. And it's all about, hygiene, giving safety, security, mitigate the risk for not only the event owner, but the delegate. We've got to build consumer confidence that people are going to come and want to meet in a social distancing flavor, if you like.
So all of a sudden, safety is now hip. Safety and health and hygiene management is going to be your baseline. It is expected for all events.
I'm really hesitant in some of the conversations I've seen where it's like, okay, we're here, this is going to be the new normal. I don't think that's the case. I think there's going to be a stage here that we're at, there's going to be a transitional stage, and then we're going to come back to something else.
We need to work on innovative concepts and think future events on different levels: face-to-face, hybrid, and purely digital.
So event, as what we would know it, need not just be a physical event, it could also be the ongoing web engagement.
There's a lot of new technology that we're evaluating, that everybody is looking at. We've all flipped to a very virtual mode. The future is going to be very different.
The hybrid meeting is going to be critical, but for a destination and an organisation like us, we have to think so innovative right now in terms of how we're going to not only secure these events, they will be smaller, they will be more local, but how do we beam the content to the world?
I can envisage a meeting that previously was for 5,000 people being for 100 selected people, that then is fed back out to the rest, or they go back and seed other meetings in other cities, or I can see all kinds of different models happening.
Necessity is the mother of invention, so I'll be very excited to see what sort of inventions we'll come up with. As the saying goes, never waste a crisis.
The biggest AI meeting in the world that was to come to Sydney at late 2021 is still on the books, but who knows in this COVID world whether those numbers will come. I would say not. I would say there will be a select few of data scientists and engineers, but we will make the most of encouraging those people to come and live and work in Sydney and educate our workforce for those productivity gains.
The destinations who are better about embedding their events in the community are going to be that much more attractive in this interim phase and going to have the sustainable competitive advantage in the longer term. If I'm getting on an airplane to go to Copenhagen next year and going to be willing to sit there and wear a mask for 8 hours and go through whatever painful process of having my temperature checked, it's not to sit in the Bella Center. Bella Center is lovely. It's Nyhavn, it's Copenhagen, it's Torvehalen. It's how do you leverage the assets that you have as a destination to be attractive to delegates and to associations who are planning the meetings? And similarly, how do you get them to understand your benefits and say, let's come together and create something beyond the scope of just the 4 days? Those destinations that get that right are going to have a huge leg up in the coming years, and the rest of the destinations are going to be playing from behind.
The thing that I always have great confidence in is that humans have had a need to meet for millennia.
That human connection and the desire to meet face to face will be as strong as it ever was, though it may look slightly different.
We're incredibly vulnerable to what's going on now. I can't think of another industry which is less well suited to a world where you're not allowed to be within 2 meters of the person next to you.
I think everybody understands that it is very important that it will start again, safely, of course, within protocols and rules that are made.
But the fundamentally important role of meetings and congresses will not change. If anything, it is likely to increase.
We have the power to bring people together, whether it's virtually or whether it's face-to-face, to share knowledge, to solve problems, to create employment and to rebuild cities.
So Greg, for destinations, is this a new normal or a transition to something else?
Well, there's so many fascinating comments in what the panel just said. I think I'm going to have to go through them one by one. So firstly, I completely agree with Martin that the instinct for human interaction is not just a deep social instinct. It's also a kind of a creative spark. It's something to do with wanting to be surprised, wanting to have something that is spontaneous, serendipitous. And I think that this leads to a permanent desire to be able to meet. The problem is that we're now in a situation where, for various reasons, it's difficult to meet. It's either considered unsafe, or it's considered impolitic, or it's considered perhaps too expensive. So, as I said right at the beginning, the speed at which we get a comprehensively available and universally trusted vaccine is pretty important here. There's a big difference between 1 year and 2 years for that vaccine to be available in terms of what happens to the meetings industry in the interim. I also think that it's probably important for us to stress that there's kind of 4 stages in the process we're in. Most of us have come out of or on the way out of lockdown now in Asia. We're just ending lockdown in Europe. We're sort of towards lockdown in different parts of North America, but we're right in the middle of lockdown in Latin America. And I think that all places will have a kind of 4-stage process. There'll be a lockdown, there'll be a transition then out of lockdown towards a kind of recovery. That recovery could take a long period of time, depending upon the nature and character and depth of the recession, and that will differ from place to place. And then when we get to the end of the recovery, we're in the new normal. And I think I would argue that the new normal is therefore some combination of what we had before, adjusted by the nature of the recession that we've been through, the continuing challenges we face in terms of human health, plus the 7 themes I outlined right at the beginning of this conversation. So I think it is possible to start to talk about what the new normal is. Now, what does this really mean for business meetings, the meetings industry, conventions, and other things? I think the first thing it means is that Lynn and others are absolutely right to talk about public safety. And it's not just the safety that can occur within the convention center or within the venues. It's the safety of the whole travel route to get people to the convention. And of course, the more you can use conventions and business meetings and other things as a way of trialing various kinds of health and safety technology, body scanning, health passporting, all of these different things, the more that you can position the meetings industry as a kind of laboratory for technologies that could be used, therefore, more widely in other avenues and venues. The second big issue is, of course, this issue about hybridity. I completely agree with Martin's comments that in future, the shape and size and structure of these events is going to change, and a smaller number of people will gather for the face-to-face interaction, but a much larger number of people will participate in various ways digitally around the world. This means that the critical ingredients here are going to be the quality of the conversation that is happening face-to-face by those who gather, and how much that creates the demand for a global audience that wants to connect digitally. The depth and the meaningfulness of the interaction that the people who are connecting digitally or remotely have, and then the quality of the experience for the digital participants and how much they feel they've had access to some kind of privileged channel that wasn't otherwise available to them on any other universally available platform. So this requires our meeting hosts and our conveners to become much, much more skilled at the kind of omni-channel strategy, just in the same way that entertainment providers and retailers have had to become skilled in this over time. And it places a strong accent on the kind of digital and omni-channel enterprise, the customer experience. And then I think Tommy's remarks as a kind of third statement that the places that will be most successful in hosting international visitors will be the ones that are most able to leverage and to congregate local participants, so that it becomes meaningful for the international participants to actually come and visit, rather than for everybody to participate online. That, of course, is the critical magnet. So if you can bring together the world expertise that you have in your region on a given subject, or you can bring together the most creative people who provide another reason to be there, it's the ability to leverage not just your institutional and territorial assets, but to leverage your home population and to generate their participation that creates, as it were, the draw for the international participants to attend, and therefore for the digital participants from around the world to enjoy a premium experience. So it's a reworking of the value chain of what makes a business event successful. And I think there'll obviously be multiple different forms of these hybrid events. But I think some of the things that Martin and Tommy and Leslie and Matthias were saying are absolutely correct. I think it is possible for us to understand what is the path to the new normal. And I think it's also possible for us to shape what that new normal is.
Well, Greg, let's get on to the main course, so to speak, of what we're speaking about here today. We're crowdsourcing ideas for this JMIC Manifesto for Economic Recovery using business events. Here's what our panel had to say about that.
At a time like this, when recovery is so critical to our organization, to our society, to our economy overall, the power of business events is something I think that has to be front and center.
And never has there been a more important time for us as an industry to harness the power of collaboration and community to create positive impact and show our worth to governments.
When dealing with government officials, how do we best go about that? In my opinion, in my experience, we need to focus on the economics, whether it's state, local, regional, national, global.
First of all, the industry needs to define itself and its agenda statistically. You know, that great economic benefit, that $35 billion in Australia, for instance, and we've become very good at the industry in measuring that in just about every country in the world. But we also need to define ourselves strategically as well, and to align our goals and aspirations and the benefits we deliver to align with the strategies and the outcomes that whatever particular government we're dealing with is aiming for.
Although the business event sector is important economically in terms of supporting GDP, jobs and exports, it doesn't have the same level of importance politically, sadly. So what we need to do is find a way to express that value and the true importance of our industry in political terms, not just economic terms.
But also to concentrate on the legacy, what's left behind when those delegates that we bring into our cities return to their home venues. What's the legacy that they leave behind for the benefit of that society?
We should be flexible in our approach with the politicians. It's not easy. They have a big problem today. They have a big problem to solve. So we have to convince them with clear arguments that many events are related to areas of the economy that are suffering a lot, and the events that we bring could help to develop again those areas.
I think far too long our industry has actually focused too much on government, and they see us as wanting a handout instead of us taking back our power. And that is by doing. We've got to realize that government should actually come to us, not us going to government.
Everything you've said, Sharif, is very, very well said. And I think one of the things we've done in London is exactly that. So, you know, you go to government, you knock on their door, you try and get their help, and they, as Isabel said, because they're only in term for 3 to 5 years, actually, unless it falls within their term of power, they're not generally interested. So we turned it on our head a little bit and said, you know, we'll just create things ourselves. So going back to crowdsourcing, we created London Tech Week. The interesting thing, though, about Tech Week is that government are now coming to us and saying, how can we leverage your event and how can we get involved and how can we do things? CIBOS, we just held it a couple of weeks ago. And we did a huge amount of work with DIT. So our Department of Trade and Industry wanted to come and use CIBOS as a platform. And that's where we got, you know, Britain helped us, the Visit Britain side of it. So it's starting to become a thing that you build it, they will come.
And that model of Bureau is actually being rolled out. I'm not saying that London was the instigator, but it is a model that has been adapted by many cities across the world.
We are beginning to see elements of destinations working with educational institutions, with the local stakeholders and the enterprise in a specific sector. And that's already coming to play with that collaboration with the meeting planners and the associations and the destination.
We had an inaugural last year around malaria. We brought all of the world's leading exponents on the disease of malaria into Melbourne. These are initiatives coming out of our ambassador program where global experts in a particular field recognise the need to gather expertise, and they come to us and say, can you help us build a conference?
I think this is a great opportunity for us to restart that conversation so that we explain to governments not just the direct economic benefits of holding an event and not just the benefits in terms of accelerating those business deals and business conversations and using events to really regenerate industries, which is what we know we can do, but also then that third element is that long-term legacy impact on the city and the knowledge economy within that destination. And this is really the moment where we can really utilize this manifesto and the communication that we have to explain that value and how that really works.
Taking Greg's language and using that to government will cut through. And so I think as an industry, we need to change the narrative. We really do need to change the narrative, and it needs to be around that innovation, around that education, knowledge, and the experience economy. I know I've heard him talk of that and the visitor economy coming together, but it's our academic institutions that are at the backbone of our cities and our countries as well.
So that we are seen as industry enhancers rather than simply as the deliverers of great events that happen to be about a certain industry. We change the angle of that narrative.
Change the narrative. Think about the language that Greg's using. I think governments will sit up and take notice.
I think the penny is dropping. I hope the penny is dropping. Governments are realising more how important this industry is. Their ears are opening, and this is our opportunity to be heard and to become a strategic partner.
There's always going to be the challenge of having different political priorities in different countries and regions.
No two markets are the same. No two legislations are the same. And what works here won't necessarily work over there.
But everyone involved, from CVBs, venues, hotels, PCOs, DMCs, event companies and performers, we all need to survive until the normalization process starts, until the new type of normal is established and we can successfully do business again. So the governments have all the power to ease this process substantially if they understand the economic and social significance of the industry.
The European Union is preparing to have a lot of money ready for our industry, especially for our industry. They also said first go to your national and local governments, because this is where the spin-off is, of course, is directly.
The EU authorities, I have to say, in this crisis are very open. They listen a lot, very attentive, and they also really use our arguments to be put into their drafts for the recovery plans, for the recovery measures, for the budgets. But at the same time, we offer them platforms and stress that we want to be part of the solution of this crisis too. We're not only demanding, we can also offer them something.
So that we are the fastest of all fast tracks to economic recovery.
I borrowed a pledge from the Iceberg that associations and their events are not in the long queue for helping in the recovery post-COVID, but in the short queue to help these recoveries, this together with our partner cities, the regions, the destinations. Let's do what is needed to make sure that we continue to be relevant and make this world a good place to live for all. After COVID-19, let us return to better.
Greg, what do you think of our manifesto, and does it change the narrative?
Well, I think it's absolutely what needs to be done. And I've read the draft manifesto, and I think it's getting us in the right direction. I want to make a couple of areas of emphasis that I think were actually mentioned by Karina and Lynn, and by Leslie and Arnaldo, and of course Jeff. It seems to me that the work that you've already been doing on the kind of economic cost-benefit analysis and defining in greater depth the medium-term legacy, just as Karina said, this is very important. But this is kind of the de minimis activity. This is what you need to do in every industry all of the time if you want support from government. I think there's something extra and additional that's now being required. I think Lynn began to speak about this. I think we need to talk much more about the innovation economy and the experience economy, and how these two super clusters, as it were, connect across different sectors in our economy. So the experience economy is retail, it's hospitality, it's entertainment, it's sport, but it's also health and education and other things. The innovation economy is, of course, science and technology, but it's also creative industries. It's also health and education in other ways. And really what you have to say to city leaders is, what kind of innovation economy, what kind of experience economy are we trying to create in the city in the future as we become competitive again? And how can we use business events as a catalyst and a driver of those? I think there are then sort of three other things I would like to say. The first thing is, I think it's very important to position business events not just as a kind of worthy contender or as something that should not be ignored, but actually to position them as a critical catalyst of recovery. That, if you like, business events are the safe, well-organized, properly resourced activities that city governments can, as it were, back, knowing full well that there will be all sorts of lessons learned about how these business events have gone, that provide opportunities for major sporting events, that provide opportunities for big learning events, that provide, as it were, opportunities for cultural and touristic events and other things. In other words, business events are volunteering to go first, to be the guinea pigs of recovery, in order to provide lessons, insights, and knowledge, which will be generously shared, of course, with these other sectors where convening is also very important. And in this way, the business events can position themselves as a leader, as a pioneer, as doing something generous for the rest of the city or the rest of the region. I think the second thing that's very important is to be aware of positioning business events in terms of the agenda that emerges out of COVID-19. Now, when I was speaking a few minutes ago about the 7 big themes, whether it's the zero carbon theme, or whether it's the healthcare and medical services theme, or whether it's the new social capital and equality theme, or whether it's the sovereign capacity and the re-engineering of supply chains to create a more resilient form of globalization, or whether it's work that's happening in how to make digital fair and how to make digital inclusive, we should think about not just how these kinds of themes are reflected in the titles of the conferences and their purpose, but also how these themes become reflected in the way that the business meetings are undertaken. the more we can do that, the more you can position business meetings not just as critical to the recovery, but also as critical ingredients or solutions or powerhouses, if you like, for the long-term future shape of the society and the economy that we wish to have. So, in my opinion, the work that has already been done in the manifesto is great, but I would add to that some of these nuances about the journey towards the new normal and how business events are an absolutely essential part of that journey being taken in a way which is pioneering, intuitive, innovative in itself. The other thing I think I would say, and I say this in a slightly different tone of voice, is that there may be options in all of this not to wait for permission or blessing, but as it were, to take actions that have a demonstration effect, as long as you're really reasonably confident that it will be possible to do that, in ways that will demonstrate to decision makers the importance of accelerating the recovery in the business meetings market first. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but it may be that you can generate all sorts of public opinion around activities. You could host some virtual events and ask people how much more they would enjoy it if they were actually able to visit. These sorts of things may be important.
Greg, one of those themes, of course, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here's what our panel had to say about that.
The other thing that I noticed in the manifesto is a reference to the UN SDGs. And what that manifesto talks about is how many of the UN SDGs business events actually support, both environmental and social, because I do think the UN SDGs are going to be even more important as we come out of this crisis.
The SDGs are a very, very valuable tool because they're a form of language which has been adopted in many spheres. And so when you talk in the language of SDGs, you can get the attention of people whose objectives and missions are built around those particular frameworks.
Because all the recovery will be focused on green, sustainability and digitization. This is everything we can deliver, and we can really help a great deal to make all the industries we serve implement that change very quickly.
What I would love to see is that post-COVID-19, we enter an era of the responsible delegate, so that delegates are going to meetings with a strong sense of purpose. They're not simply going to learn to pick up new ideas, to get stimulated, to make some new contacts. They're going because they really want to help solve a particular issue or move something forward. And that could be a business issue, it could be an environmental issue, it could be a societal issue.
Again, I think this is a brilliant idea, absolutely essential and critical to creating a coherent understanding across the business meetings industry about how these particular activities relate to a global agenda. I think it's also important to say that this is not a substitute for something else that all business meetings leaders need to do, which is talk to, as it were, the local sustainable development goals of local leaders, which may not express themselves in terms of the UN form. So I would start with every individual mayor or regional governor or state governor and look carefully at what their strategic agenda is. And I would position business events in the way that they can support them. In other words, every level of government has its own version of the SDGs. And although nearly all of them sign up to the SDGs, what they particularly sign up to is their version or their variation. So I would be careful to nuance the language towards the local variants that make sense. However, focusing on the SDGs is a very good way to provide a coherent narrative across the industry as a whole. I also think that Martin's right, that as it were, the conscious business meeting attendee or delegate, how she or he behaves, how the richness of the experience is made real for them, and how privileged we are, in a sense, to be able to travel the world, to meet one another, to visit locations that are otherwise a long distance from where we live, and to really enrich the place through our visiting, as well as to be enriched by it, is a very important message. And I think he's absolutely right that responsible participation in business events will become critical in the future. Of course, the key link here is to make sure that the important delegates who come to town genuinely have opportunities to meet with local leadership, so that local leadership can benefit from their presence in the city, just as the visitors themselves can benefit from being there.
Greg, you're very fond in your presentations of that apocryphal Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." This really has been an extraordinary inflection point, hasn't it? What do you make of how we're going to fare over the next couple of years?
Well, I think it's right to begin with a combination of enthusiasm and sobriety. I do think, as I've tried to say already, that the period of time it takes to get a vaccine, or failing that, the period of time it takes to be able to risk assure groups of the healthiness of gathering together, is going to have a dampening effect for some time. You see, the problem is that governments and regulatory bodies are never paid to take risks with people's lives, whereas entrepreneurs are paid to take risks in bringing together events, putting on fantastic gatherings, and exploiting all of the opportunities that come from having wonderful people together exchanging ideas. The problem is there's a little bit of a mismatch of culture between what governments feel they need to guarantee and what entrepreneurs feel they need to pursue. So I think it's going to be a challenging time. I think that we should see this, though, not as an attempt, as it were, to attack the meetings industry or to stop business events from happening. We should see this overall as an invitation to innovate in the way we combine physical and digital gatherings and make both equally meaningful and exciting, to innovate in the way we bring people together and the mindset that's created both by those who are hosting and those who are visiting. That's going to be very important. The way in which we elongate and elaborate the nature of the connections that are possible, so that the face-to-face connection is not the only kind of connection that is rich. And I think most importantly in all of this, how we ensure that the meetings industry is seen to be something that is in favor of a new normal that is decisively better, richer, more sustainable, and in a sense, more ambitious than the old normal was. The old normal was ambitious. It was entrepreneurial. Business meetings were at the cutting edge of helping to generate new value in all sorts of ways. The new normal needs to be even richer, and we should use the opportunity to make this amazing change to become more agile as an opportunity to be an even better version of what we were before. So I think we have to be optimistic and positive about this and accept that constraint is one of the conditions under which innovation can occur.
Greg, it has been a huge pleasure to hear what you have to say to us today. On behalf of everybody who's been involved in this webinar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Huge thanks once again to Greg Clark for his extraordinary thoughts today. Huge thanks also to our sponsors, AIME, the Asia Pacific Incentives and Meetings event, IMEX and its new Planet IMEX platform, IBTM and its new IBTM Connect platform, and Meetings Africa. And huge thanks as well to the massive cast of industry luminaries who've contributed to this programme. We could not have made it without all of you. The Joint Meetings Industry Council Manifesto for Economic Recovery Using Business Events is nearing completion, and a final version will be published soon. The content that contributed to its creation is also being made available for further viewing. Interviews were conducted by my ICEBERG colleague James Latham. The webinar was engineered by Phil Tobit. Archive video reports were edited by Toby Miller, and the webinar itself edited by yours truly. May this industry, and all of us, very soon be living in less interesting times. From all at JMIC and the ICEBERG, and from me, Robert Corrin. Goodbye.
Well, I think that was some very insightful content, phenomenal content, and very thought-provoking, I think, for everybody concerned. I'm now delighted to be able to turn over to our expert panel, who will be able to take some of the questions. Thank you for those of you that have submitted questions to date. I think the first question, if we'll kick off, what is the future for industry and knowledge clusters in cities? And the second point to that question, hasn't COVID-19 proved that we don't need to be anywhere? So I think that's maybe a good question, maybe to kick off potentially with yourself, Chloe, from an association perspective, if you may. Maybe my thoughts on that. I think, you know, Greg actually mentioned that our job as business events is to actually drive that engagement and to create those hubs and those industry sectors and areas of expertise. I think he used the phrase, we would be the convening device that brings together the intellectual capital. But what are your thoughts on that, first of all, Chloe?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think the need for industry clusters, for innovation clusters, is just as apparent now as it was pre-COVID. I think the factors for success perhaps may have altered somewhat in terms of understanding the digital component, the opportunities to form partnerships outside of them in face-to-face context. However, the reality on the ground is that true innovation happens in an ecosystem where you can bring those partners together, where you can bring the academic institutions together with industry and really create that fertile soil where innovation can really flourish. So my feeling is that that's still a necessity for innovation, and that the future of clusters in terms of how they develop, how they evolve, may change. Perhaps that was needed anyway to really continue stimulating and accelerating innovation, but that within the location of clusters within cities, really leveraging the talent, the academic institutions, government funding, strategic objectives that are happening locally, but it's crucial to cities still.
Yes, absolutely agreed. Simon, what are your thoughts around that element?
There we go. Just I actually can't see myself, so I can just about see the little microphone icon on my phone.
The wonders of technology.
Sorry if I bugged anything up earlier on too. Anyway, I think quite early on in the whole lockdown here in the UK, I wrote a blog for the BVP when I really described it as being a testing time. And by that I mean that it's been testing just how robust we are as an industry. It's been testing our profile in terms of our relationship with the government and the kind of support that they're going to give us. And listening to what Greg had to say, so many elements of that kind of test that we're still going through are really pertinent, I think. On the collaboration side too, I think the best innovation has often taken place where you have different disciplines coming together. And again, Greg kind of picked up on that, on maybe different associations coming together. So you might have mechanical engineers talking to a medical association. And I think we really do need to focus on some of those issues as a way of really driving new innovation, new developments, new experience, new knowledge and new value. And we've got to, I love the idea of not being in the long queue waiting for a handout, but actually being in the short queue saying we're here to help. I think that is absolutely something that all of us, all around the world, we're a global industry, absolutely can unite around. I think that's what we should do. That one voice, that one clear focus, absolutely critical.
Absolutely. And indeed, you mentioned driving innovation and in turn driving the economy. I think we need to view it as exactly that. It is driving the initiatives. Kai, anything to add from your side in that regard?
Two questions on the problem that shows the connected to main ships. deep level
challenges, I think, with sorry Kai, we can't hear you very well. Apologies for that. That seems to maybe try again.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? I hear you.
It seems to be is everybody okay to hear me? I think we can't hear you very well. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it possibly may be your connection, Kai. Okay, we'll move along. Maybe move to the next question. So I think in terms of being, the next question was, how do we define a mid-sized city, and is indeed it defined upon population? So I think, certainly from our perspective, I think that would probably be, for me, a mid-sized city would be defined as indeed on population, but also I think on its other capabilities, intellectual capital, the size and scale of the infrastructure, and the ability to attract business and industry sectors. So I think from my perspective, it's all of those. Do you have any thoughts upon that, Simon?
Yes, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because Greg kind of almost stopped himself when he was talking about tiers. Obviously,
yes.
It's quite sensitive, isn't it? Well, we're a tier 3. Oh, well, I'm a tier 4. Tier. So I think we have to be careful about the language we use. I think you're right, though, Shane. We know who the major players are in terms of the first core, the first tier, whatever you want to call it. We know who they are, but identifying other opportunities. I mean, here in the UK, I think if you look at things like the transport links, if you look at population, definitely, but also you look at all of those other things that are so important. We've been hearing lots of people talking about in the webinar so far. What is the intellectual capital in terms of the universities, the colleges? What are their specialities? How are they kind of leveraging that in terms of supporting bringing business events in? I know the BVP at the end of last year, kind of November time, we went up to Newcastle and Gateshead, and they've got really ambitious plans. They're going to build a new ICC, and it's linking directly to what they're doing in terms of some of the work in the local universities. And that's exactly what we've been hearing about in this webinar, isn't it? Actually bringing together, if you like, the resources to build around. So I think, yes, it is population, but it's also lots of those other bits that form the ecosystem that we work in. It's the infrastructure, it's the accommodation, it's ease of access. So, and that might mean not necessarily airports, that might mean, proper access to a really efficient railway system, like we have here in the UK, obviously. Oh, sorry. Like we might have if we build, according to Boris the other day. So, that's the way I would define it, is bringing together all those different elements. And when we think about Europe, actually, you can start to look at lots of different cities where perhaps the focus isn't there right now, but it might come soon, partly because of the massive disruption that COVID-19 has created, as people go, actually, I don't want to work in Berlin anymore, but I might like to work in, somewhere 50 miles away from Berlin, which is a much smaller, but has a much more expert kind of presence in terms of innovation in technology, manufacturing.
Absolutely. No, I agree entirely. So moving to the next question, how do we square the push towards more sustainable ways of living and working with face-to-face international business events, which often can involve putting thousands of people on airplanes and involve a huge amount of waste? So I think, from my perspective as an event organizer, I think we need to look at all of the sustainability goals and everything within the sustainability goals that we talk about in the SDG, because I genuinely do feel that we need to look at the whole supply chain in this instance, and the whole reason for coming together and the benefits and legacies of events. We heard, for example, in the video about how associations are now looking at legacy and and sustainability as even before the RFP process. I think James Rees made that point. So maybe Kai, beginning with yourself, also from the perspective of the exhibition organizer, maybe But what are your thoughts, and then maybe JMIC thoughts around that?
First of all, do you all hear me?
Yes, we do.
Good,
We're back.
Talking about the value of face-to-face over screen to screen. Well, it's interesting and telling that the only other issue that kept being discussed in the industry all through COVID has been sustainable development and the continuing efforts around the UN SDGs. Now, on the UFI side, we every year we run an UFI award for sustainable development, and this year's topic was waste management. And we had a record number of entries from all around the world, and we decided to publish not the usual 3-4 finalists and the winner. The winner is the ICC in Sydney, but also to publish a list of kind of 10 best practices, showing how far we've come as an industry in dealing with such a central issue. We have to get our homework done on all the UN SDGs, and as an industry, we've heard that call, and we are way more advanced than it appears in many ways. On the JMIC side, we've been gathering best practice examples alongside all the UN SDGs and are finalizing that for publication over the summer in the follow-up to the manifesto. So clearly, as events will probably be even more valued as that face-to-face driver, with maybe more focus, smaller audiences. The reason to travel has to be delivered by the value of the event and the purpose. And so I can quickly sneak in what I wanted to say on the first question.
Nice link.
It's great to maintain existing relationships, but ultimately you all end up in your bubble. Today we are breaking out of the exhibition industry bubble, of the conference bubble, of the advocacy bubble, and uniting our business events industry, but that's a slightly bigger bubble. The value of face-to-face is to connect bubbles and have a wider conversation. And if we all retreat to the digital space, we will lose that momentum of the interaction, and we will all become ever more focused on ever smaller bubbles.
I think that's very, very true. Absolutely. Good. And then Chloe, from an association perspective, is there anything to add from your side in that regard when your members are planning their events and looking at the legacies in which they're working with cities and how they interact with that and strategic development? How does that look?
Well, I think this is such an important question. I think it's a question that members are going to be asking, association leaders should be asking, citizens should be asking actually themselves as well. So it's an absolute crucial question. And associations do have such an important role to play in terms of taking a leadership position and ensuring that the events that they are delivering, that they do put on, are outcome-orientated events, that they are strategically planned with a very intense focus on the long-term legacies that they are seeking to achieve through those events, both globally, but also in the local host communities where they are locating the events. And so that really requires association leaders and staff to take a step change in the approach to how they are planning their meetings, to view their events as more than just, an opportunity to contribute to the bottom line as one of the key sources of revenue generation for associations. It's tended to be the focus on the short-term outputs of the event. Now what we're seeing, I think, through COVID, through the questions, the challenges that are being put to the industry in terms of the effect of international travel and on the environment, is an absolute valid question, and it's really forcing the associations to take a much more purposeful approach to the meetings that they are planning. Now, that you could say associations have always done. Associations are purpose-driven by their very nature. But the actual methodology of moving towards a legacy outcome for an event is a complex one, perhaps, and one that many associations may not know how to do. So I think more focus needs to be put on in the industry on how do you plan for legacy, how do you measure legacy, and how do you communicate that and report that back and ensure that ongoing long-term commitment to those goals is really understood and pursued over a long term beyond the event itself. And by doing that, we could start squaring up that question of travel versus the value of the meeting.
Excellent. Yes, I agree entirely. There was another question I'm just looking for now, where Greg spoke about, what the new normal could look like. And he quoted Tracy Hallowell talking about building it and the governments will come. And Lynn Smith down in Sydney talking about, the new narrative to be created. I think you made the point, Chloe, around communication and around understanding and education. The question here alludes to whether or not as an industry there is any requirement for industry professional development and upskilling to enable that through the associations, their members are gaining the skills they require to be able to change the narrative. And I guess, the second element to that, of course, is to communicate that narrative to government powers. And it makes the point that the skill sets that we need today are very different to those we needed only in January this year. So I think maybe there's a job for the industry to do there in terms of the upskilling right the way across not only the association memberships, but in the convention bureaus and partnering with the economic institutions and, as our friend James Latham would say, the knowledge capitals and the intellectual properties to be able to drive that message forward. So Kai, maybe do you have any thoughts around that?
Can't wait to see the next educational program of IBTM and AIME and IMEX. And we'll be
I'll make a note.
And we'll be happy to help and collaborate. Of course, we can talk about old normal, current normal, new normal, future normal. We always have to review what the education we provide. We always have to review the skills we teach. And for sure, one size fits all has never worked around the planet and will work even less so in the future. It will be less fixed. It will be more transitional. It will be more agile. So it's a lot of mindset and a lot of adaptability that will be needed. And where focus of many association educational offers has been on certain skills, currencies, tricks of the trade, it'll probably have to focus more on mindsets, on skill sets, and on basically levels of flexibility in a less fixed and more transitional environment. It's a job for all of us, but indeed it begins with agreeing on a narrative and on a mission for us as an industry post-COVID. And if we have that, and if we end up being in that short line of industries ready to help, and then even if I don't like the metaphor of the guinea pig that came up with the business event serving as guinea pigs, I felt a little guinea piggy last week, like a guinea pig when I went to my first physical conference again. But this is, hey, if we don't go out there and try it out, how shall we build the confidence with our customers? So it's going to be a journey. It's going to be an explorational journey for all of us. And we are here, all of us, I'm sure, to help the industry come out of it stronger.
Definitely. We remain committed to that for sure. Simon, anything to add to that from your side in BVEP?
Well, I just think I was struck by seeing Sheriff Karamat talking at that event in Barcelona that you very kindly hosted. And talking about, the government needs to come to us. Actually, in terms of upskilling, I'm aware a lot of BVP partner organizations have members who have already done it. They've already switched from being very traditional, very hierarchical in terms of their management style to becoming very agile, adopting the kind of working practices that their digital colleagues and their digital teams have been working with for a long time, have suddenly become the kind of the way of working. I spoke to somebody just this morning who said, I'm no longer an event producer, I'm a content broadcaster, and I will look at lots of different channels in order to do that. And some are dedicated platforms, some are kind of available, let's all Zoom together. But actually, they fundamentally changed their outlook, and that's what's great about our industry is we have the ability, we have the talent, and we have the creativity to make those changes quickly. And we don't need the government to tell us that's what we need to do. And as long as the UK government keeps holding back on when we can get going again, but I mean, actually, right now they won't even let us get in the queue to knock on the door and say we're here to help. So we need to either just walk past the door and go and open up a great big conference hall and do something fun. But we genuinely, I think, have that agile, creative DNA that's going to help us sustain in this. And I think we probably could teach other industries too about how that works in terms of the collaboration across lots of different disciplines, making us able to cope with omni-channels in terms of curation of content, distribution of content, engagement, getting people involved. We're very, very good at that. Just give us a chance to do that, we'll do it.
Indeed, absolutely right. I couldn't agree more in that regard. And actually, I think, again, Greg made the point, we need to create the power and the impact and position ourselves as that catalyst for recovery. I think, we know we can do it, and it's about how we get to that point. Sorry, that I think is the key. Excellent, thank you. Moving to another question. How do you think the pandemic has impacted associations, especially across Europe? And what changes do you think they may need to make to ensure they survive and thrive? I think, Chloe, that's probably right in your ballpark.
Yeah.
What do you think to that?
Well, I think, the need the forced need to stop meeting face to face, to start working remotely, has disrupted how associations have been working, how they've been engaging with their members, and that's been the biggest impact on associations. It's really forced them, it's confronted them with the question of how do we ensure, what does this mean for us as an association for the long term? Because our members now are used to engaging in a new way. If we haven't already evolved, we're going to need to evolve. And what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our membership models, for our participation network concepts of what it means to be a member? What does it mean for how we work with sponsors and key partners, how we host events? The concept of digital transformation, which has been one that's been on the cards for many, many years, perhaps underestimated as an important strategic initiative for associations prior to COVID on the whole across Europe. How can they now be moving into that space with the knowledge, with the expertise that they need to ensure that they're going to be going in the right direction without losing members? We all know that innovation comes with mistakes, it comes with errors. How can associations ensure that they are connecting to other associations to learn quickly, to learn from other people's mistakes, to see what's been done before them, and what's been done well, what hasn't been done well, and to ensure that where they are innovating their business models and their engagement strategies, they're doing so in a way that's continuing to add value to their members. So I think it's disrupted the industry, but in a positive way, because I think what we've seen is associations are still surviving, and some are thriving. I mean, I know associations that have been right at the forefront of providing solutions to the COVID pandemic. Working with governments, working across the industry, across the world, to ensure that their solutions are being delivered to those beyond their actual membership networks, to anyone basically who needs it. So they've been positioned as real solution providers, and this has been, I think, such a great opportunity to showcase just how valuable associations are. And I think that's going to continue.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. Kai, any thoughts around that yourself? No?
No.
I think.
Let's get another question in.
Let's get another question, indeed. What else do we have here? We had a question around confidence, which I think we've begun to answer. It's all about consumer confidence. How do you convince buyers and attendees to come when they probably know there are alternative ways of doing business? So I think we've talked about the digital ways of doing business. But I think, as we collaborate, we innovate and we drive our own industries and sectors forward, not just business events, but the sectors within that, be it medical, technological, engineering, whatever it may be. I think there comes a point at which you need that human interaction to move things forward. I think, Kai, you made the point earlier on when we were, just before we went live, about how much you can get done being in your office today and collaborating with your team face to face, versus, of course, what we would normally do in the digital age. So I think, my perspective, of course, I agree with that entirely. But it's about building that confidence. And I think that confidence comes through building the quality connections and a deeper understanding of our customer needs and the reasons by which we exist. That I think, you know, will be exactly what people are focusing on as we emerge from this. And I think, again, you know, our own industry is the key driver towards that. Anything else that you guys would like to think around convincing buyers and attendees? Of course, Kai, from the event organizing perspective, maybe the safety elements we need to consider and what the industry is doing there.
Indeed, this is probably the most important element. We get the license to operate back, and I'm sure we'll get the license to operate back in the UK as well. And then it is about proving that we can deliver and walk our talk, keeping people safe and healthy. This is through the good practice guidance and global frameworks and the All Secure that READ is rolling out with Informa and Clarion on the exhibition side. And essentially, we need to build that track record of show after show after show around the world, of event after event after event around the world that takes place, where people come together and leave with their order books full or their heads full of ideas, and without having caught a virus. Now, we've had dozens of shows in China. We've had a number of shows in South Korea, and we are seeing more and more shows taking place all across Asia, not causing additional infections. Just this morning, we had an UPI online session where we were discussing how various cases of shows having taken place in China and in Poland, and the measures they took to keep people safe. And building this narrative on the health and safety side will give confidence back to people who are kind of sitting on the fence about, is it okay to me to travel? I feel kind of okay, but not too okay. But if they see that all around the world, the show organizers, the event organizers, the venues, the suppliers, we all do our best to keep everyone safe, this will encourage them to overcome that fear and come back.
Absolutely.
I'd like to add one moment, 1 second.
Yes, we've got 1 minute to go. So
super quick. So
there are lots of questions we haven't got to, but we'll try and answer those separately. But yes, please.
I was just going to say, to follow up on what you were saying, Kai, on the how do you convince them that it's safe, that it's healthy, that they're going to not catch this virus? I think the second question that's going to come is, why is it so important? Why is attending that meeting added value to the companies, to the delegates? And so that's going back to that question of measurement. How are we tracking the impact of the meeting in the long term, beyond just the economic side of things, socially as well, for healthcare, innovation, all of that? Tracking that is going to be such a critical component of that changing narrative, I think, moving forward.
Definitely.
And just to squeeze
Excellent way to end, guys. Sorry, I'm going to just have to cut in. I think we've got just 30 seconds left. I think that concludes the session today. Apologies for the questions we didn't get to answer, but thank you all, your panelists, for all of your expertise. That's been excellent contribution. I'm sure it's not the end of the dialogue. Thank you for joining us. It's much appreciated in this industry and this time when we need one voice to collectively stand together. We'll now, of course, be passing the baton across to IMEX to deliver the Americas as we go for the fourth session of 4 around the world. And all that's left for me to say really is thank you very much once again. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. And we very much look forward to seeing you at IBTM World 2020 in December in Barcelona, face to face, where I'm sure we will continue a lot of these dialogues. Thank you so much, and stay safe. Take care, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Thank you.